Imagine this. You're in 1600s Europe, waking up to the sound of your neighbor's goat screaming again. You make some herbal tea for your headache, mutter about the weather, and go back to sleep. By morning, 3 women have told the local magistrate you fly at night, talk to cats, and have suspiciously clear skin for your age. Congratulations. You're now a witch. In an era where a crop failure was never the farmer's fault, but yours, people were one paranoia-fueled whisper away from a trial by fire. If your neighbor's cow stopped giving milk, it was your doing. If a child had a fever, you cursed him. If a man had impure thoughts, well, that's your witchy charm working overtime. Some say history repeats itself. Others say never really ended. The witch craze didn't come out of nowhere. The 16th and 17th centuries were a bubbling cauldron of war, famine, religious zeal, and men with too much authority and too little to do, often bored and often wearing powdered wigs. Add in a few apocalyptic sermons and a newly printed guidebook called the Malleus Maleficarum, basically the How to Spot a Witch for Dummies manual, and the result? Pure chaos. And as you settle into sleep, wherever you are in the world, let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? And if stories like this soothe your curiosity as much as they calm your mind, go ahead and subscribe. There's more where that came from. So sit tight, keep your hands visible, and for heaven's sake, don't mention your herbal remedies, unless you want to spend your weekend strapped to a wooden chair over a river. You are 36, which is what we now call middle-aged. But in 1600s Europe, you're suspiciously alive. You've outlived 2 children, 3 midwives, and your first husband, who died coughing into his own beard. You think that should make you wise. Your neighbors think that makes you unusual. The floorboards creak beneath your bare feet. The fire's long gone out. In the hearth, soot whispers of warmth, but refuses to offer any. You pass by your bundle of dried herbs hanging near the door. Time for cooking. Mugwort for sleep. You don't even look at the mandrake root anymore. Too many people already looked. Outside, the mist refuses to lift. The air is soaked in suspicion. You feel it like a second shawl. Pig miscarried last night. The blacksmith's wife says her womb has gone dry. A traveler claims he saw a fox walking on 2 legs. Someone must answer for all this. And today, the whispers are curling toward you. Your name flickers in records like a candle that someone kept trying to snuff out. Because you live alone. Because you read. Because your bones don't creak loudly enough when you kneel in church. Because someone once saw you talking to a raven and you smiled afterward. Because your cheekbones are sharp and your tongue is sharper. And both of those things terrify men who've only ever prayed with their fists. There's a knock at the door, but it's not a knock, not really. It's more of a summons. The magistrate stands outside, flanked by 2 men who smell of leather and distrust. One holds a book, one holds a rope. You are not arrested. Oh no. You're simply being asked to appear for questioning. Voluntarily, of course. But when you step outside, the village children stop playing. One woman makes the sign of the cross. The baker's wife drops her basket and forgets to pick it up. You are not yet a witch, but you are no longer not one. Congratulations. Your trial has already begun. So how did people know you were a witch? Scientific evidence? Nah. All it took was gossip, a weird mole, or being too helpful. And here's where historians start to argue, because what follows next depends on who you believe. Let's say a local child falls ill. The baker's wife says, "Wasn't she staring at the boy last week?" Suddenly, you're that woman, the one who doesn't attend church every Sunday, the one who reads, the one who owns a black cat and doesn't bake pies for the town meetings. In short, suspicious. Next thing you know, you're being dragged in front of a local judge, who, by the way, believes sneezing too hard is a sign of demonic possession. The interrogation begins. You're asked things like, do you deny having danced with the devil? Why do your eyes look so intense? Can you recite the Lord's Prayer without stumbling? Spoiler. And if you mess up a word, you're clearly possessed. At this point, your best bet was to pray they don't call in the witch pricker. Yes, an actual job for someone who was extracting the so-called proofs used against accused witches. It was the infamous pricking test. This guy doing the job would poke your skin with sharp needles, searching for spots that didn't bleed or didn't hurt, believed to be marks left by the devil. Oddly enough, even tiny birthmarks or scars could count as these devil's marks. So if you had a mole or a freckle, congratulations, you were now suspicious. If you cry, emotional manipulation. If you don't, inhuman detachment. Basically, you were playing a game where all the rules are made up, and you would lose either way. Oh, and you smell like smoke already. Now you might think, well, that sounds kind of ridiculous. And you wouldn't be alone. Some historians quietly chuckle at the thought of witches being outed by harmless moles. But then again, when you're stuck in a world without microscopes or blood tests, a birthmark might look like a secret brand. The infamous swimming test was no better. They'd tie your hands and feet and toss you into water. If you sank, you were innocent, but you might drown. If you floated, you were guilty. So basically, the test was a lose-lose situation. Not exactly a gentle way to prove innocence, unless you were a good swimmer. And here's a bit of something that probably sounds mean today. Some accused would try to fool the testers by starving themselves, or drinking herbal concoctions. Imagine preparing for your trial like a weird diet plan, hoping to outsmart superstition with hunger and plant juices. But historians still debate how common these tests really were. Some say they were rare and mostly myth, while others believe they happened more often than we realize. It's a bit like trying to find out if vampires ever really walked the earth. Stories blend with fact. And then there's the witch cake. Yes, cake, but don't get your hopes up for dessert. Villagers mixed rye meal with the accused's urine, baked it into a cake, then fed it to a dog. If the dog acted strangely or died, it was proof the accused was a witch. You might say, that sounds like the worst bake sale ever. What I can say is that the whole trial was a strange mix of fear, superstition, and what passed for science back then. And it didn't end there. Witnesses could claim they saw your spirit causing harm, even if you were miles away. These spectral evidence claims were taken seriously, which meant your ghost could get you in trouble, even if you were fast asleep at home. It's hard to imagine now, but silence could be deadly. If you refused to confess or name others, suspicion just grew. Some historians say this led to entire communities unraveling in a web of fear. A chain reaction nobody could stop. So this strange, shadowed world was one where logic was tangled with fear, and survival often meant walking on a knife's edge or floating in cold water, hoping not to sink. But in the world of witch trials, another thing to note was that gender wasn't just a background fact. It was the whole story. Most accused were women, somewhere between 75 and 85%, depending on where you look. Why? Because being a woman in the 1600s meant navigating a world where your voice was often silenced, your choices controlled, your very body subject to suspicion. Women who were widows, or who owned land, or who healed with herbs, they stood out, and standing out was dangerous. Men held most power: magistrates, Priests, landowners, they set the laws. They decided who was normal, and they whispered rumors that became truth. Some historians argue witch hunts were a way to control women's growing independence. Others say it was about fear of female sexuality, fear of the unknown, fear of change. There's even a theory that the rise of capitalism, with its new social orders, made independent women a threat to male economic dominance. Whatever the cause, accusations often centered on women who refused to fit the mold. The outspoken, the healers, the widows, the other. Men were accused too, but rarely in such numbers. And when they were, they often played very different roles, like witches' familiars or cunning men who used their powers for profit. But for most accused women, the trial was a final warning. Step back into silence or face the flames. So now you're in the thick of it. The trial has begun, and the weight of accusation hangs heavy in the air, almost like the thick smoke from the fires burning somewhere in the distance. Fear is contagious, spreading faster than any illness, twisting neighbors into suspicious strangers overnight. But here's something not many remember. In some places, accused witches could be anyone. It wasn't just the weird recluse in the woods. Sometimes it was the village healer, the midwife, or the outspoken widow who didn't fit the expected mold. People who helped others, or simply lived differently, could suddenly find themselves under the harshest light. And that brings us to a fact that's both strange and sad. Many accused women were actually community caretakers, wise in herbs and healing. But those skills, once treasured, could become proof of dark dealings. Imagine being thanked one day for easing a fever, and the next day dragged to a trial for it. The fear wasn't just about witches. It was about control. Control over chaos, over misfortune, over the unknown. When crops failed or illness spread, someone had to be blamed. It was easier to point fingers than to face the randomness of life. Now for a little humor, or maybe it's just grim irony. There was a belief that witches could fly, but only if they rubbed themselves with an ointment made from pretty disgusting ingredients. Historians debate the recipe, but some say it included things like toad skin and bat wings. Not exactly your typical beauty cream. So if you found yourself accused of flying on a broomstick, you could at least rest assured that your nighttime flights were probably a lot less glamorous than the stories suggest. But historians still argue about just how much belief in witches flying influenced trials. Was it real fear, or just rumors spun out of control? Maybe a little of both. And here's the thing about confessions. Many accused ended up confessing, but not because they were witches. Often, torture, exhaustion, and despair made them say anything their interrogators wanted to hear. A desperate bid to end the pain. Sometimes these confessions named others, sparking a terrible chain reaction. It's a dark, tangled web, isn't it? Where fear feeds on itself, and stories turn into warnings that keep growing louder. It's almost like the villagers were caught in a storm. They couldn't steer, grasping for anything solid, even if it was built on suspicion. Now that one had been properly accused, it was time to help them confess. Because everyone knows, the best way to get the truth is by stretching someone's limbs until their joints pop. The enhanced interrogation menu included the rack, a literal stretch of the imagination, thumb screws, not fun, sleep deprivation, hello, hallucinations, and the ever-popular strapado, where you're hoisted by the arms behind your back, then dropped suddenly. It's chiropractic horror. Today, we might call it injustice. Back then, it was simply called justice. Eventually, most people confessed just to make it stop. And what did they confess to? Oh, you know, flying at night, feasting with demons, kissing the devils. Anatomy, and other things you couldn't even imagine without LSD. These confessions were written down word for word by men who claimed this was all for public safety. But really, it read like bad fan fiction, with a lot of goats. If you were lucky, you got to name others, neighbors, rivals, random folks you once sneezed near. That gave you a few more days to live, until the circle came back to you. Justice in the witch trials wasn't about truth. It was about fear, power, and spectacle. And people? People love a good spectacle. Remember, public execution was the Netflix of the 1600s. Everyone showed up. As the trial moved forward, it's not just voices and accusations filling the air. Some strange objects and rituals might feel downright bizarre today. For example, did you know that one common practice was searching for the witch's teat? This wasn't a compliment, obviously. Accusers or officials would literally search the accused's body for a tiny extra nipple or mark, believed to be a spot where a witch's familiar, their magical companion, suckled. It sounds invasive and cruel, and it was. But back then, it was proof that you'd made a pact with dark forces. What's more, some accused witches would actually confess to having familiars, little animals like cats, toads, or birds, often because they were tired, scared, or had been pushed so hard they said whatever was asked of them. It wasn't uncommon for an elderly neighbor's cat to become a source of suspicion. The idea that your friendly barn cat might be spying for the devil is a little chilling to imagine. The evidence is shaky. Like, she has a birthmark, or she didn't scream when a chicken died. But logic isn't welcome here. The big finale? A test. Often the infamous water ordeal, where one was tied up and tossed into a pond. If she floats, it meant she was rejecting baptism, and therefore a witch. If she sank, then she would be pure, and probably dead. Sometimes they'd ask you to touch the afflicted, and if the person suddenly screamed, your touch proved guilt. Of course, everyone screamed. They were coached to. There were also spectral evidence trials. Someone claims they saw your spirit tormenting them in a dream. That counted in court. In summary, the legal system was less innocent until proven guilty, and more guilty until drowned. One fact that surprises many is how often the accused witches were expected to defend themselves, sometimes without any real evidence presented. It was a strange sort of trial, where silence or inability to prove innocence could speak louder than words. If you've ever wondered what it was like to face such uncertainty, imagine the knot twisting in your stomach as you wait for a verdict that could mean death, exile, or something worse. The pressure was crushing, and the hope for mercy often felt like a flickering candle struggling against a strong wind. And there's a little irony here. Some accused people confessed, not because they believed the stories, but because confessing was the only way to stop the pain. A confession might even buy a bit of time or a less brutal sentence. Desperation turned truth into fiction. Historians still debate how many of these confessions were genuine and how many were forced or imagined. The lines blur between fear, coercion, and the human will to survive. You might find it strange, but in some trials, the accused were allowed to make a last statement, a moment to speak directly to those who would judge them. Some used it to declare innocence. Others shared warnings or prayers. Imagine the courage it took to speak when your fate hung by the thinnest thread. The end didn't always come with fire. That's the myth, that witches were always burned, shrieking, flames climbing their skirts like devil's fingers. But in England and the American colonies, most executions weren't fiery. They were quieter, more bureaucratic. Hanging was the standard. Quick if done right, botched if not. The accused would stand on a cart or ladder, the noose scratching their neck, rough rope twisted from hemp or hair. Then a shout, a shove, the world drops out, and your feet kick empty air. If your neck didn't snap right away, it could take minutes. The crowd would watch. Not all were cheering. Some just stared, chewing bread, unsure how to feel. In Scotland and on the European continent, yes, burning was common. There, they believed fire was a cleaner punishment, not just for the body, but the soul. Some witches were strangled first as a mercy. Others, straight to the stake. Dry wood, oily kindling, a torch. The crowd would gather, babies, vendors, street musicians. Execution was family-friendly. You were marched to the site, prayers muttered, and then silence as the fire started to crackle. You weren't just killed. You were displayed. A warning to others. Don't be different. Don't be loud. Don't be female and alone with a garden. Records described the flames, drawing screams from the belly. One chronicler in Wurzburg noted that the smoke of 29 women tasted sweet, like fruit before rot. He was not invited to many dinner parties after that. But not all accused witches died. Some were found innocent. Some were released on technicalities. The accuser had no witness, or the confession was taken under torture, which even back then raised a few eyebrows. Some simply slipped away. A sympathetic jailer. A bribe. A distant cousin with a fast horse. There are stories, maybe apocryphal, maybe not, of women who faked madness, drooled in corners, plucked out their own hair. The judges, fearing a curse or demon possession, dismissed them. One woman reportedly spent 3 days speaking only in chicken sounds. Another smeared herself in pig's blood and screamed hymns backward. No one dared come near her. A few received what the records called mercy. But mercy, in this case, often meant a lesser punishment, not forgiveness. A whipping, branding, exile. One woman in Essex was sentenced to live in silence, forbidden from speaking in public for 7 years. She reportedly learned to whistle answers, which only made the townsfolk more uneasy. And then there were those whose executions became a spectacle. The Pendle witches in 1612, for example. 10 were hanged in one day. Some say the gallows creaked like a church organ. In Germany, whole towns turned out for public burnings, children on their fathers' shoulders, sweetmeats in hand. What better way to teach virtue? Some historians argue these mass trials weren't about witches at all. They were about power, about towns proving their purity, or officials distracting from crop failures, war, or disease. The witch was just a scapegoat in skirts. But even in all this horror, there were moments of strange grace. A judge who turned away. A priest who whispered comfort in the final hour. A stranger who left bread by the cell door. Quiet resistance. Human cracks in the cold stone of history. So if you were accused, you might die. You might suffer. You might vanish into legend or into footnotes. But sometimes, just sometimes, you lived. And when you did, the world still whispered behind your back. Now, imagine this. The trial was over, but the story doesn't end with the final sentence. For many, life after the trial was a long, uncertain road, even if they survived. In some villages, the accused were shunned, whispered about for years like ghosts that never quite left. You might have lost your home, your family, your friends, all because fear had wrapped its fingers around the community's heart. And here's a fact that might surprise you. In some cases, people were branded or marked, literally, so everyone would know they'd been accused. It was a kind of scarlet letter, but far worse, a constant reminder of suspicion and pain. And if you think that's harsh, well, here's a twist. In parts of Europe, some accused witches were eventually pardoned. Decades later, once the hysteria faded. Imagine returning to a village that had forgotten your name, or worse, never truly believed you were innocent. And you might wonder how anyone could survive such a life. Some found refuge in distant towns or cities, starting over in shadows. Others were forgotten in prison, their fates lost to history. Historians still puzzle over how communities healed, or didn't, after these trials. Did the fear vanish like smoke, or did it settle quietly into the cracks of daily life? And a little irony to think about as you drift. The same communities that hunted witches often depended on their knowledge: the healers, the wise women, the midwives. Sometimes the line between villain and hero was thinner than a whisper. And so by the time witch hunts fizzled out in the late 1700s, tens of thousands had died, mostly women, their crimes, herbal knowledge, living alone, owning property, being inconvenient. And here's the kicker. Centuries later, many of them have been posthumously pardoned. Thanks, I guess. But look around today. Ever heard someone insult a woman's confidence? Dismiss her ideas as crazy? Shame her for being too much or not enough? The witch trials may be history, but the mindset? Still lurking. So if you're outspoken, intuitive, or just really good at plants, wear it proudly. In another century, you might have been burned for it. Now, you can make a YouTube video. Lucky you. So, as the fires of suspicion faded and the powdered wigs gathered dust, history quietly turned the page. But the whispers? They never truly stopped. Somewhere in the back of the mind, beneath the hum of traffic or the rustle of sheets, the echoes of those old fears still live on, reshaped, renamed, but never quite forgotten. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, maybe you'll carry with you the thought that once, not so long ago, all it took to be feared was a cat, a cup of tea, and clear skin. History is never really gone. It lingers like a scent in the air. So close your eyes, breathe deep, let the noise of now soften, and let the past keep whispering. If you're still awake, let me know where you're listening from. It's always a comfort to know where these stories are being heard. And if this little piece of the past helped ease your mind, go ahead and subscribe. There are many more stories waiting in the dark.